You're listening to WMPG 90.9 Gorham, Portland, Southern Maine Community Radio from USM. Live from the Orion Cygnus arm of the Milky Way galaxy, this is Scientifically Speaking, a weekly half-hour program devoted to elegant curiosities, and I am one of your hosts, Sarah Chang. Joining me, as always, is Bernie Rhyme, DJ Star Watcher. How are you, Bernie?
Yes, hi, Sarah. Very good. Thank you.
Bernie's our professor of the astronomy lab at USM and our local protector of the night skies. Reach out to us at WMPG Scientifically Speaking at gmail.com or on Twitter at WMPG SciSpeak. And you can head on over to WMPG.org to find the last 5 weeks of archives of all of your favorite shows, including this one. Bernie, could you let our listeners know what is up in the night sky for this coming weekend?
Yes, certainly. So this will be Friday, October 29th, just 2 days before Halloween. So we're going to have a waning crescent moon, just 1 day past the last quarter. So it's going to rise around midnight, and it's going to set around 3 p.m. 3 planets are still up. Actually, I just saw them tonight, well, a few nights ago now. They're actually visible by pretty early. I saw all 3, Venus, Saturn, which is the faintest, and Jupiter by 6:15. So by 6 p.m. you can see 2 of them. They're nicely lined up. The moon, of course, doesn't come up till later. So you can see those planets. And then basically, with the waning crescent moon, as I said, it would rise around midnight. Those planets. So the days are getting shorter. They're under 10.5 hours. The sun doesn't come up till after 7 and already sets at 5:37. That's why it's dark enough by like 5:45 to even see Saturn, which is 15 times fainter than Jupiter. So there's probably no more meteors. The Orionids were last week. The Leonids are coming up in a couple more weeks, middle of November. So probably won't see any meteors unless you can see a stray one. So we'll talk about those a little bit tonight. So we're halfway through. Halloween actually marks the halfway point into the season. So we're halfway through fall, only 6 weeks to go to the solstice. So days are finally getting a little bit cooler, but a lot of places have not even had a frost yet. So we'll have one soon. That's about it for the week.
Awesome. Thanks, Bernie.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And if you couldn't take notes fast enough, you can also check out the monthly What's Up column in the Portland Press Herald. So today's show is, Bernie, you're going to have to help me out here because I had no idea what you were talking about, but our title of the show is called Bump in the Night. And why did we call it this?
Yeah. Well, bump, as far as, actually I traced back the term back to the mid-1800s. Just spooky things at night that people didn't expect. So I related it to astronomy things in the sky above us, and you're going to relate it to some things on the earth. Related to werewolves and goblins and, some noise that might not repeat more than once or twice and it'll make you kind of frightened. So that's the bump part, like someone running into something. I mean, ghosts can't run into things, but that type of thing. So things in the sky run into things all the time, but you're not really aware of that because they're kind of invisible. So maybe now our listeners will be more aware of some of the things going on like that, which can be frightening in the long run.
Nice. Well, I hope we don't actually scare you too much.
Yeah.
But we are going to talk about some kind of spooky things or things related to fear and, all part of the Halloween festive fun. And then one other treat that Bernie will kind of help out with is also how some Halloweeny objects in the night sky that we should look for when we're doing some of our stargazing over the next course of the next season. I guess you could probably see most of these. So first thing I wanted to start off with was actually, Bernie, what are some things that you are scared of?
Well, I'm not really scared of the dark because I'm out in it a lot for the astronomy, but I have led owl watches for kids at your nature preserve in Wells, and I was kind of surprised how scared they were just basically of the dark. So if there was any noise, any sudden noise, even they're with other kids and they have other, counselors and adults with them, they'd be pretty frightened. And I guess if I was out, maybe camping alone or something, that you never heard something that I might think is a creature or a bear, I guess I'd be frightened of that. A big creature, not a little one.
Just big ones.
Yeah, right, the big creatures.
Yeah, so there's 2 syndromes, and I'm going to talk about the first one that's a little bit less but there's this syndrome called Williams syndrome, and it's actually a genetic condition that is present at birth. It can affect anyone, but it's kind of characterized by a bunch of medical problems, cardiovascular disease, developmental delays, learning challenges, but it also occurs with kind of these highly social personalities. And these people who have Williams syndrome often don't develop the same kind of biases as maybe, I guess, normal people, if you will, do, because they don't experience something called social fear. Meaning they're super like hyper social, they're very empathetic, they're super friendly, and they just don't get like danger signals. So they'll just kind of freely interact with anyone, and they tend to not cultivate like a preference for people. And so what happens with these people who have Williams syndrome, the amygdala, which is a part of the brain that's involved in processing emotional memories, is just generally like not firing as much during kind of social situations to signal that, oh, this might be threatening or this might be scary. And so there's also this connection between the amygdala and, I guess, the fusiform face area, which is basically how we recognize faces. And that tends to be really weak in these people. I don't know if you've ever met anybody with this, but they tend to be some of the friendliest people you've ever met. And I guess they describe these people as kind of being so social with you as if like you had known or they had known you forever. No, it's just that kind of, the wall just isn't there. And it is also, I guess there's a loss of 26 genes, which is what kind of defines this particular disorder. And they also mentioned that a missing chunk of chromosome leaves these people with a kind of elven-like face, which is kind of interesting. But so now there's this other syndrome that's very similar but almost more extreme, and it's called the Urbac Wyeth disease. I guess it's a genetic disorder. And this disease essentially destroyed both sides of this one patient that kind of had circulated in news and in science research. So this disease had destroyed both sides of her amygdala, which, basically means that she has some kind of brain damage, and it also means that she basically knows no fear. And so this one patient, I think her kind of code name was SM. The researchers had done a bunch of questionnaires for her, surveys for her, like has she ever experienced fear of public speaking, fear of death? Has she ever just had her heart like beating really fast because of fear of being judged? And that's kind of never happened to her. She the researchers like made her watch all these scary movies, and she was not afraid at any of them. They made her go through like these haunted houses, and she would just like laugh at the things and all the things that are coming out. They made her kind of go look at like arachnids and snakes, and she's just like, ooh, I want to touch it.
Like Steve Irwin always went after those poisonous snakes.
Exactly.
So friendly. Yeah.
And there was also another 32-year-old male at the time who also had some, I guess, a lesion in the right amygdala, and there was like a study around this person who basically showed that this person could never be startled. And so, anyways, the whole point of this was they were able to kind of make this connection that the amygdala, if there's ever damage with the amygdala, it suggests that that structure kind of plays this key role in kind of perceiving and producing a negative kind of emotion to whatever it is that's there, specifically fear. So I don't think either of us have any of these issues. I don't know, maybe Bernie or less, because it sounds like you're not really afraid of much. But
Well, no, I mean I mean, some people want to be frightened and they like scary movies and that type of thing, but they know they're in a safe situation. So if you're out camping and there could be bears around, then you're not so safe. It's not likely you'll be attacked, but it's not like you're in a movie house and you want to be scary, you want to be scared and so on. So
yeah,
big difference.
right. And
Yep.
speaking of that,
hmm
so there's arachnophobia. You don't have a fear of spiders, do you?
No, I like spiders.
You like spiders.
Yeah.
In what ways? Like,
Well,
do
I
you
mean, I'd
go
put them
up
out. I
and,
wouldn't kill them off, and I don't know
yeah,
they're good because they eat other insects and so on.
yeah. But if you saw one kind of crawling on you, you'd just be like, oh, hey.
Well, yeah, it doesn't matter. I wouldn't buy a big pet tarantula or anything,
Sure, sure.
but but yeah, no, they're fine.
So I wanted to segue to arachnophobia because, kind of like what we were talking about with fear, this is something where we've been trying to figure out, is this something that we learn, because of culture? Like, oh, my mom was afraid of spiders and therefore, I've been conditioned to be afraid of them as well. Like, that's what I saw as the appropriate reaction to spiders. And so I'm going to react the same way. Or is it something that's just kind of embedded into us as a species? And so there was a study.
No studies.
There's always a study. There was a study where scientists had recruited basically the most innocent and neutral of study participants, which were essentially human babies. So I was like, wow, what would they, some of the creativity that goes into creating these studies, I'm just like, that's so interesting. And so they have these unsuspecting infants. And this was with the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences in Germany. And so they took these 6-month-old children or babies, and basically introduced them to or exposed them to images of spiders. And they also kind of showed them some other things like flowers. Spiders and flowers were one group, and the other group saw snakes or fish. The babies would just sit on their lap, and they would just be shown these of either flowers, spiders, or snakes or fish. And so what they were looking for was a change in the child's pupils. In the case of spiders, the average pupil dilations were 0.14 millimeters, whereas with flowers, it was 0.03. When it was a snake or a spider, the baby's pupils would get significantly bigger. And so the conclusion that they made was that fear of snakes and spiders is possibly evolutionary origin.
Yeah.
Of evolutionary origin. Yeah.
Yeah. Because modern issues wouldn't be because, people didn't, like hundreds of years ago, didn't have electricity. And so some other things now that we might be afraid of would not be genetic.
Mm-hmm.
But those could be, and it's good because it could have saved your life, perhaps, if you were startled by something way back hundreds of thousands of years ago or something. So that would be good. Yeah.
So the other thing that there's another, we're going to want to talk about zombie seeds. Have you heard of zombie seeds? I don't even know what that means.
No.
But what a group of scientists in England, this was not too long ago, they found that infilled agricultural ponds often turn into wet ghost pond depressions. And what that means is that these ghost ponds basically, it's basically like the loss of wetlands, but it's not necessarily loss of all the species there. So there's still some water in there. And that's what a ghost pond is. And so buried ghost pond propagule banks, what that means is these buried ghost ponds have kind of organic matter that still remains, that allows the original organism to propagate. So in our case, we're talking about seeds or spores, which is why we call them zombie seeds. So those seeds that kind of are buried in these ghost ponds can actually continue to remain viable for about 150 years. So if you like dug one up and it was within about 150 years, you could still grow it. And so these, like, having this group basically suggested we could resurrect these ghost ponds and potentially restore some of these extinct local species. And having we hear this a lot with kind of agricultural intensification. We have this widespread loss of wetlands, and that poses a real threat to aquatic biodiversity, especially as we're kind of draining things and pumping water out and trying to just fill land. And so this group of scientists found that at least 8 aquatic macrophyte species could still germinate from the seeds and spores after 50 to 150 years of dormancy in the sediments of ghost ponds. And so it's kind of a positive thing from the study, because usually these studies kind of show like, oh, we need to reverse all this stuff that we've done to the land. And what this paper has shown is you could actually restore some of the biodiversity loss by, taking these propagules out and bringing them back to life. So zombie seeds. That's the story there.
Mm-hmm. Like bringing those little tardigrades back to life.
Mm-hmm.
They can live out in space and radiation for hundreds of years and stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Let's go to the skies, Bernie.
Yeah, so I did the celestial things that would be scary or would bump each other. And some of these you may have heard about, and you wouldn't really see them per se, like the plants and the bats and that type of thing. But it's good to know about them because it's a big thing. It kind of does affect all of us and our whole way of life and everything. So it probably has far more effect on us directly than just being afraid of any particular thing like a spider or a bat or something. So the first one would be the satellites. There are over 32,000 pieces of space debris or space junk that's being tracked now. And these are over 10 centimeters, so softball size and up. So it's big enough for us to track. We're getting better radar and all the time ways to track these, but it's a lot. Maybe 4,000 of those are working. Maybe another 5,000 are no longer working, but still intact. They haven't decayed yet or fallen apart. And then the rest of them are just pieces of space junk, mostly concentrating in a certain orbit of between 500 and 1,000 kilometers up. So fortunately, just above the space station, but not much higher. It's getting very crowded. But the thing, that's just a number, but to relate it, just 10 years ago, it was only about half as many. It's only about 17,000 pieces they were tracking. And now, as you probably know, with Starlink and Elon Musk, they're launching 60 satellites every 2 weeks. A friend of mine actually saw them in a big chain going across northern Maine. I've never actually seen them, but I've seen pictures and things about them. So it's 120 a month. And then, of course, he's not the only one. There's something called OneWeb. They're going to launch another 648 by the end of next year. So not as many as Musk, but getting up there. And of course, Bezos didn't want to be left out. He's got his Project Kuiper internet, and he's going to be launching 3,200 satellites.
Holy
so, yeah. So the problem with this, and all in about that same orbit. If it were geostationary or, then it wouldn't be as big a deal. But it's getting really crowded. So there is something going on. So if they start hitting, little pieces hitting other pieces, space is big, and this hasn't really happened yet. But there is somebody named Donald Kessler, and I actually watched some YouTube videos by him. He's a senior NASA space scientist. He's retired now, but he came up with this in 1978. So it's called the Kessler Effect. So it's a positive feedback loop. If there's too many little pieces of space junk, I don't know what the number would be. Maybe it's 100,000. So this may not really start for a couple more years, but at the rate we're going, it wouldn't be long.
Yeah.
And then they would create more little pieces, and they would just keep hitting within that zone. It wouldn't be across all the space. But it's really interesting how he started that. He was just checking, because this is happening in the asteroid belt naturally all the time. And you expect that, and that's fine. That's between Mars and Jupiter. They're not going to hurt us. Eventually, they can be knocked out of that belt, and there could be a slight issue with them. But it's happening all the time. So he just did all the math. He was just relating it to gas molecules bouncing around in a box, and obviously he's a good math person. So he figured this all out, and that's called the Kessler Effect. And it's certainly happening. However, not on that scale, but we did some foolish things before we kind of really knew that. He knew it, and some people in NASA. But for us, we blew up a satellite in 1985. So that was a while ago, way before there was much junk, and we didn't think much of it. Then the Chinese blew in 2007. They blew up a defunct weather satellite on purpose, even though they were warned by others. NASA knew by that time this was an issue. So they hit it on purpose to test something, and that created so many more pieces of space junk that are still up there. They haven't come out of orbit. And in 2009, there was an accident. A Soviet satellite called Cosmos collided with an Iridium satellite, which is part of that constellation of satellites that's supposed to be used for communications. They never really built all of them. And in 1996, there was a French satellite that was in an accident and created several thousand more pieces of space junk. We have not yet deorbited. So this, it really, mushrooms very quickly,
Yeah.
and we're not at a thing like inside the asteroid belt, but it's pretty bad what's going on. So 95% of all the stuff in low Earth orbit is actually junk. Only 5% is good working satellites that are benefiting us, and the rest is junk that's kind of very dangerous. I mean, it's not really going to get in the way of a picture because it's so small. It's not going to reflect a lot of light. But if this feedback loop, this tipping point is hit, then that could be really bad. So them using this, actually, it's called a tragedy of the commons, because you think of that when you graze cattle on the field that's owned by the government, which is indirectly owned by us. But in space, we kind of own the space.
Hmm.
But these satellite companies like Musk and Bezos and others are making some good profit off of this, and they're putting too many things up there, which could be dangerous for other things they have up there. So everyone kind of knows about this and is trying to work with this. They are working on like giant space arms that might be gathering some of this junk up, and there's different ways to do it, but it'd be expensive, and they're not sure who's going to pay for that and so on. They could only collect a few pieces a month. They can't just go up and suddenly get to 32,000 pieces, down to 25,000. It would take, more time than making more pieces.
Right.
So it's a really dangerous thing going on up there.
Is there anything out there about how we could remove some of the space debris?
Yeah, there's a couple of good ideas. One is like a space tug, where you could actually go up to a particularly large piece of debris that we can track and kind of harpoon it. So, and then, and then actually you can actually lose some lasers, and some of those potentially you could even do from the ground because we're tracking those bigger
Oh,
pieces. So you can blow them up with the lasers, so it might be a little more effective. There's really no way to just scoop them because they're really kind of far apart.
right.
You would think if there's so much junk, I mean, 32,000 pieces is a lot, but space is huge too. Even within that narrow zone, you can't just scoop them. So you have to target them specifically. And there's ways of doing that, and it would be expensive, and people have to agree to pay for it and so on. But that's a couple methods. And then there's an interesting rule, actually, where to help, not to overpopulate that little narrow zone we talked about. It's called a 25-year rule. So once you have a satellite up there for that long, which is just about the limit of its time, most are less than that, then you usually have to deorbit it to go below that and see if there's a place in the Pacific you can crash it safely, or you have to boost it to go above that narrowly overpopulated zone, and then that would help clear up that zone, and the Kessler effect would not take place.
Gotcha. What is the likelihood of us, if let's say you and I got on a rocket right now and we went up to the moon, that we would hit something along the way?
Well, no, it's a good question. Actually, it's pretty likely, but we would be hitting something really small.
Yeah.
So there's tons of things up to 1 centimeter, and there's ways you can shield the aircraft. All the things that have come back are full of little divots, like little craters,
Mm,
but they can be shielded. It's called Whipple shielding. So anything up to 1 centimeter, it has a huge amount of energy and velocity, at the speeds at 40 miles per second and up. However, the most dangerous are between 1 centimeter and 10 centimeters.
yeah.
Those we can't track. We can't shield for them. And above 10 is fine because we know where they are. We're not going to run, into those because we know where they are. And under 1 centimeter is not going to hurt us. But 1 to 10 centimeters, and that's a big range, and there's probably 500,000, maybe a million of those pieces up there.
Hmm.
So we'd probably be hit by something. It probably wouldn't lose a spacecraft, but we'd be hit by many somethings on the way up
Yeah.
there.
Mm.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then what about asteroids? Is there anything out there naturally that we should be afraid of?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Actually, if you look on spaceweather.com, there's always some near Earth asteroids listed. And I tracked one once, maybe, I don't know, like 10 years ago or something. It was fairly faint, but it came within the moon's orbit of us. And we knew its
Whoa.
path. We calculated it, we all the math and computer model. So a friend of mine, we went to the observatory, fired up the big telescope. It was 11th magnitude. It was a quarter mile across. So that was the entire length of how far back our observatory is from the road. We finally found it. It was tough to track because it was moving really fast. And I got a little movie of it, so that's kind of neat.
Cool.
So that thing, again, a quarter mile across would be a huge issue. It's not as big as the one that killed off the dinosaurs, but it's bigger. It's probably about the size of the one, the Tunguska event on June 30th, 1908. That was maybe a little smaller than that. And the thing about that is that another one hit almost in the same place. Some of you may have forgotten. It's way smaller. This was probably only maybe 30 yards across or half a football field. That's the Chelyabinsk Meteor. That was February 15th, so the day after Valentine's Day of the year 2013. So just over 8 years ago. And that was particularly strange because we knew of a close approaching asteroid that was going to come within the geosynchronous orbits of 22,000 miles. It was going to go like 17,000 miles. So as long as we know about it, it's fine. You could probably even see it. It was bright enough to see. But the other one, the Chelyabinsk, came in from the sun, and we didn't expect it.
Hmm.
So it hit in Chelyabinsk. It made the tons of meteorites. I've actually touched one. We had John Wallace on. He has a piece. He bought a piece of this meteorite, And 1,600 people were injured. Fortunately, nobody died. It was from the glass. When they heard the sonic boom, they ran to the windows, and then the window shattered. There's several levels of the boom that's happening. There's the shock wave and a sonic boom, because obviously they create sonic booms because it blew up maybe 5 miles above the earth. So the shock wave and the boom. So fortunately, no one died. But it could have been much worse, and it was, maybe just a few hundred miles from Tunguska, and about 100 years later. And there's lots of asteroids, and things hit us all the time, but most of them are the ocean, and people wouldn't see them, or they see a fireball or something. It's not a big deal. But a lot of people were photographing that, and they were going to work, and the Russians have like dash cams because there's a lot of stage accidents with cars that they make. So if they have a dash cam to prove that, this was real or whatever. And I've seen like 20 different really good movies of that Chelyabinsk Meteor coming in. So that happens, but not all. It used to happen a lot, like every few weeks, every few months. Now a big thing like Tunguska might be every about roughly 100 to 200 years. Something like the dinosaurs would be like every 10,000 years. So we're okay with that. But yeah. But those could definitely be bump in the night, because most of the pieces of meteorites that we do see, just the stray meteors, they would come from asteroids that are outside of the belt between Mars and Jupiter, they will be coming from those asteroids. And another thing, of course, would be like the UFOs, which are now UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomenon. So they may or may not be hitting each other or whatever, but often, of course, there will be regular, easily explainable causes. One, for instance, when the planet Venus is low on the horizon, which it kind of is now, but it's not super bright yet. That's often been mistaken. A fireball or a meteorite or a bolide might be mistaken for some UFO. I remember one, actually, I saw this one. It was around November 17th. It was a bolide from the Leonids coming right up in a few weeks. So I knew it lasted about 5 or 6 seconds, which is long for me, and it left a nice bright green trail. And of course, I knew what it was, and it looked very dramatic. But there was someone who was driving on the highway nearby, somewhere in Maine, probably Route 95, and he called the police and turned this whole story in, that this light was following him for 5 or 6 minutes. And we made a really dramatic, dangerous, scary story out of it. Because, driving along on the highway, you don't really see what it is. And obviously, he didn't know about fireballs and things. So they're so often mistaken. And when Venus is low, the police and 911, they get flooded with calls of UFOs and UAPs and everything. And we know it's just a planet Venus. It can shimmer and do some kind of strange things. But if it sits there for more than a few minutes, it's perfectly natural and normal. And that could be really frightening to people.
Yeah.
So, all
hear
those
that.
things are frightening.
Bernie, one last thing that we want to do a quick skywalk of some of the Halloween things that we could potentially see in the night sky.
Okay, there's 4 or 5 that we brought up that you can look to. One is called the Cat's Eye Nebula. So it looks like a cat's eye. It's actually a planetary nebula. It would look somewhat like when our own star blows up in 5 or 6 billion years. It'll look like that. And they take all different shapes, like the ring, the dumbbell, and so on. And actually, another one we're going to do is the owl. So that's M97 in the Big Dipper. So you need telescopes to see these. Also, it looks like the face of an owl, so not really scary, but it has some of the parts within that star that blew up. It was called planetary because at first they thought maybe they had discovered a planet because it was bigger than a regular star, but obviously it wasn't moving like a planet. And then there's a star in Perseus called Algol, the demon star. And it's just a demon because it would change brightness. It's a regular variable. It's a long period variable. There's nothing frightening about it. But if you didn't know about that, you can see it from maybe, I think you can see it without binoculars when it's at its brightest, and then you need binoculars or telescope when it's fainter. And then there's a couple different nebulas that look like a witch's head. There's one in Cygnus in the Veil Nebula, and you mentioned one near Orion too.
Yeah.
So you could kind of interpret that as some kind of a witch's head, or one is even like a witch's broom nebula and a witch's head nebula.
Oh, nice.
But yeah, lots of things up there to see too.
Yeah, so there is your hallowed night skywalk.
Everyone should be frightened now.
Right.
All these things that we don't even see. Satellites colliding over us all the time. Yeah, well, not yet, fortunately. At some point, maybe they will. Maybe we'll have it figured out by then.
All right. Well, happy Halloween, everyone. We hope that you have a safe and fun festive holiday. And with that, you have been listening to Scientifically Speaking here on WMPG with myself and Bernie. Stay tuned for Something for the Weekend with Anella from 1:30 to 3. And from your favorite nerds, just a reminder to vaccinate, mitigate, and then we can all celebrate.
You're frightening, yeah. It don't sound that frightening.